The area between the Baltic and the Black Sea, barrier and buffer. The northern region is concentrating our attention more and more. Has the Baltic become a NATO lake? If it has, then potential enemies seem to be able to sail around with impunity. Join me, Jan Darasz, for How We Got Here.
The Baltic States are preparing for the worst. Even though they are part of history's most powerful military alliance, they are not taking the threat of a Russian invasion lightly. It's not just a military which is conscious of this danger. Ordinary citizens like these in Estonia are lending a helping hand in protecting their borders. They do so in organized volunteer groups. Meanwhile, Lithuania and Latvia have played host to many a NATO drill, wanting to ensure that their allies are as prepared as they are. For none of these countries wants to lose what they gained when the communist bloc and later the Soviet Union came crashing down into the dark pits of history.
35 years ago, hundreds of thousands of Estonians, Latvians and Lithuanians joined hands in a human chain stretching from Tallinn to Vilnius to demand their freedom.
Russia, as shown by its actions in Ukraine and early in Georgia in 2008, clearly isn't keen on letting the former parts of the USSR live out their lives in peace. Its reawakened imperial dreams are focused on the Baltic Sea and its region. In the past, Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union held dominion or influence over half of these countries. Moscow wanted the Baltic to be its very own pond. Today, its only access to the Baltic is through Kaliningrad and the Gulf of Finland. Just this year, Russia issued threats about redrawing its Baltic Sea border. The Gulf of Finland was to be a key part of this. Much like the Baltic States, Finland is also quite aware of the dangers of Russian hunger for territory.
We have a special experience and special history with Russians, starting from our autonomy period and after that as a neighbor of the big Soviet Union.
Like its southern friends from NATO, Finland has had to fight the Russians back. In 1940, the valiant Finnish defense made Stalin's winter war far too costly of an endeavor and ensured their country's sovereignty, though at the cost of territory. Russian designs for the Baltic aren't just of the military kind. In the 21st century, the sea has been crucial to Moscow's expansive energy export industry. Projects like Nord Stream, heavily criticized by many nations around the Baltic, were tools of Russian imperial will. And perhaps given its fondness for hybrid attacks on infrastructure, Russia isn't too happy with just letting others play in what it sees as its own watery playground. The shadows of the mystery of the cutting of 2 undersea cables in the Baltic, some say, point in one direction.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Piotr Szymański, Senior Research Fellow at the Security and Defence Department at the Centre for Eastern Studies. Welcome to the programme.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, we'll be discussing the Nordics and the Baltics, that northern area. What has been the historic form of tension between Russia and the Baltics and the Nordics? Do they differ, or are they of a similar scale?
So, look, you can argue that this competition and struggle for the dominance over the Baltic Sea has been ongoing since at least 16th century.
Yes.
With changing dominant powers like Sweden, Germany, later on Russia. So we are seeing and witnessing the new versions of this struggle, and of course we have some important developments since the annexation of Crimea and Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine, namely the membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO. So there are many people who argue that the Baltic Sea has become a kind of inner lake of NATO alliance. I can prove that it is not true, since we have sabotage operations from the Russian Federation, since the Russian shadow fleet, the so-called shadow fleet, is operating there.
Chinese captains captaining captains captaining Chinese ships.
Exactly.
Tearing up the cables.
Stopped in their quarters. So it is something noteworthy, and I think that it is very important to underline that we don't have the end or yet another end of history in the Baltic Sea region. So this is still the area in which NATO and NATO member states and countries which are around the Baltic Sea have to strive for more security.
We'll stay on to history for the time being before we move on to policy. Russia has this sort of philosophical view of Ukraine as a Novorossiya, the 18th century new Russia. Is there a similar way it treats the Baltics and the Nordic countries, or is it just making mischief because it can?
I mean, if you take a look at the demands of Russian Federation from December 2021, when they had actually outlined their vision of the security in Europe, in which we should be back to the end of Cold War status quo, then you will get an answer to that question, because during the Cold War we had something which was called back then the Nordic balance. So we had Finland aligned, de facto aligned with Russia, striving for neutrality. Neutral Sweden, pursuing close military and economic cooperation with the West, leaning closer to NATO. And then two NATO member states, Norway and Denmark, which back then had a very peculiar policy of being NATO members combined with some self-imposed limitations, like no military exercises, especially closer to the border with Soviet Union in Norway, no stationing of foreign troops and foreign bases, and no deployment of nukes. So this combined gave us this sense of stability and equilibrium in the region. And of course, this thinking is outdated, having Finland and Sweden in NATO, but actually in the mindset of Russian decision makers, it is something to strive for, and this is something they desire in the north.
Do they, looking at it from the Russian perspective, they see NATO very, very close to St. Petersburg?
Yeah, very close to St. Petersburg, looking at Estonia and Finland. Finnish media published recently a piece of news on the survey conducted in the Russian Federation, which shows that actually 1/3 of people questioned in Russia don't know that Finland is a NATO member. So it is a tricky question at the same side. But of course, this enlargement of NATO and Finnish NATO membership influences the way Russia thinks about its northern military expansion. So, of course, troops which are stationed along the border with Finland and Norway are nowadays currently fighting in Ukraine. So there is no imminent military threat from the land forces of the Russian Federation for the Nordic countries, but still Russia has plans to develop military units all around the Nordic area, and in the long-term perspective, the Nordic states are perceiving Russia in a similar way as Poland does, so as a long-term, consistent, permanent threat.
Yes, and obviously to the north there's the Arctic Sea and the Arctic Circle, which is being opened up strategically. What are the countermeasures that NATO, in particular, you mentioned NATO as a de facto lake. Kaliningrad, the enclave, is a spot of old Russia or old Soviet Union on the shores of the Baltic. And yet, you mentioned the shadow fleet, the cutting of the cables. What are the practical responses that NATO can do, or does it just have to take these blows on the chin?
I mean, a lot has happened over the recent years, and if you look at the land domain, we have forward land forces of NATO being upgraded to the level of brigade in Lithuania and in Latvia. Britain promised to be able to deploy additional troops if needed to Estonia in order to enhance its battalion size forces there to the level of brigade. Plus, we will soon have the establishment of the forward land forces in Finland. So there is a permanent presence of NATO troops in the region, so on the eastern borderlands of NATO. And then you have Baltic air policing and rotational deployments of ground-based air defense systems, which both are giving a sense of more security towards Russia and securing air domain. And right now, Polish Prime Minister is visiting Sweden, and there is a meeting of Nordic and Baltic Prime Ministers, the so-called Nordic-Baltic 8. So Donald Tusk is participating, and he outlined an idea of
the naval police,
naval
yes.
policing. So this domain should be cared of as well. And the setup is there because NATO has its naval permanent groups and deploys vessels and ships towards the northern flank and southern flank. There are altogether 4 such groups on the permanent basis. Plus, at the beginning of October, allies from the Baltic Sea region, namely Germany, Poland and Sweden, established the so-called Baltic Command Task Force. So it is based on the naval command of Germany, but on the rotational basis. So next 4 years, German Navy will be responsible for that. From 2028, Poland will take the leading role. And this is a small command element which takes over the responsibility over NATO naval assets in the Baltic Sea region. So given the ongoing modernization programs of different navies all around the Baltic Sea, the setup is there. So we have to coordinate, and the idea to enhance NATO's allied maritime presence in the Baltic Sea is the needed one. So given the ongoing sabotage operations, and given the importance, the profound importance of underwater infrastructure for the imports of gas, like Baltic Connector or the Baltic pipe, this is something that NATO should take care of.
It seems fairly easy in military terms or in naval terms to shut the Baltic off completely from Russian influence. But what about the land terrain? The Baltic states are very small. They've got their backs to the sea. There seems to be no room for a kind of a
yes, no strategic depth.
Defense in depth. What's the response of the Baltics in particular? We have these, as you said, you mentioned the NATO forces present there. Are they going to be enough to deter any significant classical Russian military attack?
So I think that deterrence works. So we see that Article 5 works. There are no direct military attacks on the NATO soil from the Russian Federation. And the Baltic states are, of course, modernizing their own armed forces, rising defense expenditures. There is a change of philosophy in deterrence among all the countries which are bordering Russia. So from this deterrence by punishment, so if Russians go in, we will retaliate and punish Russia, to deterrence by denial. So we will try not to allow Russians to go in. So the investments are there. So systems like HIMARS, air defense, rocket artillery. This is something which is ongoing in the Baltic states, and we have to still keep in mind that NATO, through its military exercises, is displaying its capabilities to reinforce the Baltic states if needed, with troops from the UK, US, France, Germany. So we don't have to look only at the troops which are currently being deployed. We have to look at the broader NATO defense plans, so regional plans. So there are 3 regional plans. One is for the northern flank, one southern, and one central. So the Baltic states are under the Joint Forces Command Brunssum in Netherlands, a part of this central defensive plan for the Central Europe, together with Germany, together with Poland. So it is all interlinked. And on top of that, we still have nuclear deterrence. So we don't have to forget that NATO is still a nuclear alliance, and nuclear deterrence works.
We've seen a final question to you. We've seen the conflict during the Second World War between Soviet Union and Finland, 1940, and then later in 1944-45. The northern flank seemed to be at least a secondary area of theatre. It was the great Central European plain, which was the primary thrust. Is that still the case, or is the northern area becoming more critical in Russian and NATO thinking? We see the Arctic paths, the sea lanes being opened up. Is that changing at all, or is it still on the side and with the main area of operations in Ukraine?
So the region, Nordic region, has traditionally been perceived as a peripheral one in old warfare, and it has changed. Even during the Second World War, for Russians it was very important to, from their perspective, to secure Leningrad. So the northern shores of the Gulf of Finland and its southern shores had to be secured from their perspective. But everything has changed with the development of nuclear weapons. So we have to keep in mind the Northern Fleet and its second strike military capabilities, submarines with intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear warheads. So if we look at the map, it may seem that the Northern Europe is peripheral, but if we look from the Russian side, it is a very important border. Norwegian-Russian border and Finnish-Russian border. So I would argue that this strategic importance of the region, especially that we have Finland and Sweden in NATO, is growing.
Yes, you always have to keep a look on the other side of the hill, as they say. Piotr Szymański, thank you very much for coming on to our programme.
Great pleasure.
That's all we have time for today. Join us next time for How We Got Here.